In 1967, a gospel singer from Memphis walked into a recording studio and delivered a vocal performance so revolutionary it would transform popular music forever, creating the blueprint for soul, funk, and R&B that every artist would follow for generations. Her vocal techniques, her way of bending notes and infusing spiritual emotion into secular songs, became the foundation of modern singing across all genres from pop to hip-hop to rock. The recording session produced one of the most influential musical performances in history, a song that defined an era and inspired countless artists who would become global superstars. Yet she received only a few $100s for the session, never earned royalties from the millions of records sold, and died 30 years later in poverty and obscurity while the artists she influenced became wealthy beyond imagination. This is the heartbreaking story of Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the godmother of rock and roll who changed music forever but died with nothing. Born in 1915 in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, Rosetta Newburn grew up in a world of profound poverty and racial segregation during the darkest years of the American South. Her mother was an itinerant evangelist preacher, traveling from town to town performing in African American churches and tent revivals throughout the rural South. Young Rosetta learned to play guitar from her mother, mastering the instrument by age 4 and performing alongside her in religious services. By age 6, she was already astounding church congregations with her extraordinary vocal power and her innovative guitar playing that mixed gospel spirituals with blues techniques considered scandalous in religious contexts. The Pentecostal church where Rosetta grew up valued ecstatic worship, emotional services where believers expressed their faith through passionate singing, rhythmic movement, and uninhibited spiritual expression. This environment shaped Rosetta's vocal style, teaching her to pour raw emotion into every note, to bend and stretch melodic lines for maximum impact, to use her voice as an instrument of transcendent power. These gospel techniques would later revolutionize secular music when she applied them outside church walls. In 1938, at age 23, Rosetta moved to New York City and began performing in the famous Cotton Club and other Harlem nightclubs. She scandalized the religious community by bringing sacred gospel music into secular venues, playing spiritual songs in nightclubs where people drank alcohol and danced. Church leaders condemned her as a traitor to gospel traditions, but audiences were electrified by her unprecedented fusion of religious passion with popular entertainment. Rosetta signed with Decca Records and began recording both gospel standards and secular songs with her distinctive style. Her guitar playing was revolutionary, using electric amplification and distorted tones years before anyone called it rock and roll. She played with aggressive rhythms and driving beats that made people want to move, transforming gospel spiritual ecstasy into physical energy that anticipated rock music by more than a decade. Her recordings in the late 1930s and early 1940s essentially invented the sound that would later be called rock and roll. If you want to discover more pioneering musicians whose revolutionary innovations were stolen by later artists who became famous and wealthy, subscribe now and activate the notification bell. Every week, we expose the untold stories of musical geniuses who created entire genres but died in poverty while others profited from their groundbreaking work. During World War II, Rosetta's recordings became incredibly popular with both black and white audiences, crossing racial barriers that rigidly divided American society. Her song performances sold millions of copies, making her one of the most successful recording artists of the 1940s. She performed for integrated audiences at a time when segregation laws made such gatherings technically illegal in many states. Her concert appearances drew thousands of fans who had never experienced the electric energy of her gospel-infused rock performances. In 1944, Rosetta gave a legendary concert at Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C., performing for an audience of 25,000 people. The event was a wedding ceremony, with Rosetta marrying her manager in front of the massive crowd before performing an extended concert. The stadium show demonstrated her enormous popularity and cultural influence, proving that an African-American woman could command audiences as large as any male performer or white artist of the era. But Rosetta never received fair compensation for her revolutionary contributions to popular music. Recording contracts in the 1930s and 40s were notoriously exploitative, especially for black artists who had little legal recourse against predatory record companies. She typically received flat fees for recording sessions, sometimes as little as a few $100s, with no royalty payments regardless of how many records sold. Decca Records and other companies made fortunes from her recordings while she survived on modest performance fees and whatever money she could earn from constant touring. In the 1950s, Rosetta watched as white performers began copying her style and achieving mainstream success with rock and roll music she had pioneered. Elvis Presley acknowledged her influence privately but rarely in public interviews. Little Richard, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis all studied her guitar techniques and vocal delivery, incorporating her innovations into their own music. The British invasion bands of the 1960s, including the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, were directly influenced by her recordings, which they discovered through American blues and gospel collections. Yet while these artists became global superstars earning millions, Rosetta struggled to maintain her career. The rise of rock and roll as a distinct genre dominated by white male performers pushed her back into gospel music, the only market where black female artists could still find regular work. Mainstream media and music historians began telling the story of rock and roll as if it had been invented by white Southerners in the 1950s, erasing Rosetta's pioneering work from the narrative. By the 1960s, Rosetta was performing primarily in small churches and gospel concerts, far from the stadium shows and mainstream success she had enjoyed 20 years earlier. Her health began declining due to diabetes and other conditions exacerbated by years of financial stress and inadequate medical care. She continued performing because she needed the money to survive, playing small venues for modest fees while rock superstars she had influenced sold out enormous stadiums worldwide. In 1970, Rosetta performed at a blues and gospel festival in Manchester, England, where young British musicians finally recognized her as the source of sounds they had been copying. The European audiences gave her standing ovations and treated her as the legendary figure she deserved to be recognized as in America. But this belated recognition came too late to rescue her financial situation or restore her health. Rosetta suffered a stroke in 1970, partially paralyzing her and ending her ability to play guitar at the level that had made her famous. She spent her final years in Philadelphia, living in modest circumstances with family members, unable to perform and receiving no pension or royalties from the decades of recordings that continued selling. Sister Rosetta Tharpe died on October 9, 1973, at age 58, her brilliant career ended by poverty and illness. Her funeral was a small affair attended mainly by gospel community members and a few musicians who understood her importance. Mainstream media barely covered her death, with obituaries that failed to acknowledge her revolutionary role in creating rock and roll. The music industry she had transformed continued generating billions of dollars, but none of that wealth reached the woman who laid the foundation for modern popular music. For decades after her death, Rosetta remained largely forgotten outside gospel music circles. Rock and roll history books mentioned her briefly, if at all, typically as a footnote in chapters about the genre's origins. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, established in 1986, did not induct her until 2018, 45 years after her death. This belated recognition was symbolic but meaningless to Rosetta herself, who died never knowing she would eventually be acknowledged as a founding mother of rock music. The music industry built trillion-dollar empires on the foundation Rosetta created. Rock and roll became the dominant popular music genre worldwide, generating enormous wealth for record companies, performers, and associated industries. The vocal techniques she pioneered, taking gospel emotion and applying it to secular songs, became standard practice across all genres. Her guitar style, using electric amplification and distorted tones with driving rhythms, defined the sound of rock music. Yet Rosetta received almost nothing from these massive commercial successes built on her innovations. The exploitative contracts she signed gave record companies perpetual ownership of her recordings with no ongoing compensation. The copyright laws of her era provided minimal protection for performing artists, especially black musicians who lacked the legal resources to fight corporate exploitation. The cultural racism of the music industry made it easy to erase black innovators from historical narratives and credit white performers with inventing genres that black artists actually created. Today, more than 50 years after her death, music scholars and historians have finally begun acknowledging Sister Rosetta Tharpe's revolutionary importance. Documentaries and academic books detail her contributions to rock and roll, soul, funk, and virtually every genre of modern popular music. Contemporary artists like Brittany Howard, Lizzo, and numerous gospel musicians cite her as a primary influence. The United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp in her honor in 2021. But these posthumous honors cannot change the fact that Rosetta lived and died in financial hardship while the music industry she revolutionized generated wealth beyond imagination. She should have died as a wealthy legend, celebrated and comfortable, receiving royalties from the countless recordings that used her pioneering techniques. Instead, she struggled with poverty and medical bills, performing in small venues until stroke ended her career, dying in obscurity while rock superstars she influenced lived in mansions. The story of Sister Rosetta Tharpe reveals the brutal economics of the music industry, particularly for black artists and women who created revolutionary innovations but lacked the power to demand fair compensation. It shows how cultural racism erased black innovators from historical narratives, crediting white performers with inventing music styles that black artists actually pioneered. It demonstrates how exploitative contracts and inadequate copyright protections allowed record companies to profit indefinitely from artists' work while paying them almost nothing. Every rock guitarist who uses distortion and driving rhythms is playing Rosetta's innovation. Every soul singer who brings gospel emotion to secular songs is using her technique. Every performer who crosses genre boundaries between sacred and secular music follows the path she blazed. The entire landscape of modern popular music exists because Sister Rosetta Tharpe had the courage to bring gospel power to secular stages and the genius to create a new sound that would transform global culture. She deserved wealth, recognition, and comfort. Instead, she received exploitation, erasure, and poverty. The least we can do is remember her name, tell her story, and ensure that future generations understand that rock and roll was not invented by white Southerners in the 1950s, but by a black woman from Arkansas in the 1930s who changed music forever and died with nothing.